Okay, so what are we doing today? Well, we've got a Nerf gun mod. I was doing these for a little while and pretty much decided it wasn't profitable, but I've had a request from the son of a friend who wants theirs modified with a heavier spring and a few other little performance mods. So I'm going to crack this guy open and we're going to put a bigger spring in it. The spring I plan on using is one of these straight out of China, but these are about 7 kilogram springs. They replace the existing ones, which are considerably smaller. I think I have one behind the camera here. This is not the same one, this is a trimmed down one, but that's about the same length as the existing springs. In addition to that, we're going to remove some air restriction. So let's get this open. Alright, we've got the screws out. There are 7 of, and they're all the same length. And now we just separate the clamshell halves. I might get my special little tool here and make sure that I haven't missed a screw. No, I haven't. Got my little spudger, as Big Clive calls them, spudgers. There is one more screw, and that's the battery cover. Now that's the thing I should probably have checked first, is are there leaking batteries in here? We'll have a look, find out. There aren't, and the terminals look very good. This is probably one where they've bought it off the shelf and never bothered to install the batteries. Alright, now we can see inside. There's a little piece of plastic dropped out. So the first thing we're going to do, and we'll lubricate all this afterwards, is we're going to get this chamber out and we're going to remove the air restrictor and look at what size spring we have and see what we can modify to fit in there. So let's get this chamber out. We're stripped down to our chamber and we can just pull our plunger straight out. We'll get to that bit in a minute. What we're interested in at the moment is the air restrictor, which if you look down here, you can see this nozzle which prevents you from putting darts in backwards. That's also part of the air restriction system. Now, usually these are glued, but sometimes they're not. We're going to lift both these little tabs here and try and separate this section so we can get in there. We've got things separated, the camera angle's changed slightly, but we're going to open these up, and there is an air restrictor. Now this valve is designed to stop it from pushing air through if you haven't got a dart in there, and that is a bit of a pain in the rear. It stops you firing things you shouldn't from it, but it also really drops the air out and limits it. So we're going to chop this out with a pair of flush cutters. Got handy dandy flush cutters, which means we can get up flush, and we're going to take off the 3 clamps on either side here and pop them out, and then we'll push this backwards through the chamber. That will come out. This is still on a spring in here, and there's still some more to come out. This is the bit that's usually glued, but today it's not. So we're going to get in here with these guys. Again, get up flush against the side there. Trim out these 3 standoffs. And it should more or less pop out. Should being the key word here. If we can get this out. Looks like a bit of a hack job. But we're nearly out. This can be the tricky bit. Get this cap back out. Right, we'll be back in a moment after I've sworn at this a little bit. Okay, we have our sections removed. This is our little plunger and that spring that disappeared under everything. This is the spring to hold the plunger shut. So we're going to close and piss all them off. Now these have standoffs that go all the way through. In some of them I've gone to the trouble of actually removing that entire unit, but I think that does assist laminar airflow. So we're going to put these 2 sections back together again, and that's our unit basically. This also serves as a backstop for the plunger. So I'm going to leave that in here. And now we're going to switch over to the spring assembly. Now, there's a few different ways you can tackle this spring assembly. The first thing I'm going to do here is take this spring off so I don't lose it. That's our trigger spring. Now this spring fits fairly freely on here. Now you could remove this end piece and go through all the rigmarole that it is to get that off, and I don't want to damage that. That's actually a pretty integral part. I've got a different way of getting these springs off. I'm going to change the camera angle slightly. So what you can do is you can separate the sections here much like you would a key ring, and once you can flip that over the top you can untwist the spring. And that's probably a bit of a gross oversimplification here, but we get this part of the spring over that shaft and then it comes off relatively easily. So from here we get this bit over. Once we're through that first loop, we can just twist this around and around and around, being careful not to damage these notches. They're the trigger notches. With a heavier spring they become very important if you don't want false triggering. From here we can just untwist and pop the old spring off. Now we find the new spring. I've got a couple of spring options here. This is our original spring, and this is the closest I have in diameter, but it is slightly shorter. Now these do work very well and they're quite heavy. They're about a 5 kilo spring. However, I have a 7 kilo spring that's not designed for this task and does work, but you'll notice it's much longer than that shaft. It will compress to the same length, and for this young fellow he wants some ridiculous overkill. So we're going to put a non-correct size spring in here, or non-standard spring, and see what we can do. Sometimes these can be a little difficult to trigger, and so I have to put a heftier trigger spring in as well. But we'll assemble this and see how we go. So fitting the new spring is basically the same as the old one. I've got a trick here. I'm going to roll this backwards until those two sections separate, and once we're on, then we can roll it round the other direction, and then we can continue to do this and it will go on. And the little rotating bit on the end actually helps get this on. The tricky bit we get to now is getting these last few coils on, and this spring only just clears that trigger latch. This needs a pair of pliers. We're going to roll it backwards until it fits on. There's our new spring, which is a bit of actually a lot of overkill, but oh, there's a bit of spring tension, guys. Alright, so that is a lot of spring tension on there now. I just need to get that top coil situated a little bit better. There we go. Alright, let's get this put back together. Now, normally when I get these, this plunger is very dry and buggered up, and I have to re-lubricate it and put a new O-ring. This one's practically new, and it's got a lot of good oil in there, so I'm not going to touch that, but I'll be lubricating everything else. Okay, so where we're at now, if I adjust the camera up a bit, we need to put our return spring in here for the trigger block. Now this is our standard spring, little tiny guy. I have a slightly heavier and longer spring to do the job, and we're going to pack that into that space. That will just help it prevent misfirings. So let's get this put in. I'm going to do this off camera. It's a real tricky job. Alright, so our return spring is in, and you notice the extra tension is pushing this up. You've got to be gentle here or everything can pretty well explode on you. So now it's time for some lubrication. I have some over here. I have some PTFE dry lube. I have to shake up in the rattle can. We'll come along here a bit and give all the trigger mech a fresh spray of this stuff. There's going to be some extra load on all this now, so it's going to move in ways that it never used to. So give it a good spray, we should be right. Okay, now we get everything back together. Again, a tricky job, I'll do off camera. Put everything back together, but then I noticed this. This captive nut goes in the buttstock in that little hole there so that your battery door can screw shut. I've got to put that back in. Alright, we're putting the screws back in. Crucial to note, put these rear two screws in first. Because if you don't, you might have a catastrophic loss of spring containment, and you pretty well have to start all over again and probably find yourself some new eyes and new wall coatings and little bits and pieces everywhere. Probably worth noting with springs like this, definitely wear eye protection. They can be pretty deadly. And of course, once you've done this with a Nerf gun, needless to say, it doesn't comply with any of its safety ratings or anything anymore. So use eye protection, especially when using hard tip darts like I do. I buy the ones with solid rubber tips, not the cushioned ones. They can do some serious damage. So treat them like a real firearm. Now, one problem you can run into here with a smaller diameter spring is it won't engage because the spring coils are actually interfering with the trigger mech. And the trigger mech, I've forgotten to put a spring on that as well. So I do need to dismantle this and redo a few things. So yeah, or it could be that I just have to settle for that bigger diameter spring. So we'll pull this apart and do some mods, and then we'll show you the end result. Alright, so I've got the bigger diameter but shorter spring in here, and it's going to fit fine. I've put the return spring in. Now, why I'm doing this little bit of video is this tiny little 2.5mm nut just took me about 2 hours to find. It sits back in this little recess in here. Now they're a 2.5mm nut, and they're designed to hold the battery bay in. I can do a mod to make these work with a 3mm screw, but I prefer not to if I can avoid it. But the little trick we're going to do here is we're going to put a dab of super glue in, because these things are insanely easy to lose. So we are just going to put the tiniest little drop super glue in here just to help retain this screw. It's literally all you need, the tiniest little bit. Normally I'd apply that with a dressmaker's pin, but I'm being lazy at the moment. So that should hold in nicely, and future disassemblies shouldn't ruin it, but they are actually startlingly hard to find. So yeah, I can get 3mm, I can get 2mm, but 2.5mm is really difficult to find. Otherwise, everything else is pretty easy to find, and I would certainly suggest you get yourself a bunch of magnets. This is a little 3D printed bit holder I made for my Victorinox knife a while ago, and it all holds together with magnets and forms a part tray with magnets inside, along with room for a few other things. So yeah, this is what I use, and it's also handy for sweeping the floor for lost nuts like that thing. So let's get this buttoned up. Right, so we've got the larger diameter spring in. If I wanted to get really industrious with this, I'd stretch that spring so it gets a bit more travel all the way through. But let's just give this a quick test. I think that's going to work quite fine. Certainly a lot more kick in it than there normally is. I'm using these Chinese darts, and these are a solid tip dart. We can probably demonstrate here by, they're a very solid tip. They do sting a little bit more, but you do tend to observe fire control when that happens. So the only other thing I've got to do here is stick some batteries in this and see if everything works. Right, we're going to whack some good Vata branded batteries in here. These guys are good for sitting long term without getting damaged. And drop these guys in here in opposing polarities. We're going to lock the door down, and you probably couldn't see that, my camera angle's wrong. It's a little difficult in close quarters, this camera the way we've got it. I'll do that screw up. I've got to wait for it to grab that nut. I'm sorry if my hands are in the way. Let's see if our little trigger reticle works. It looks like it does. There's a red dot coming up here. You guys can probably see down here. And it diffuses slightly through the side to light up that little bit in the end. But that should work, and that should create... Well, this one's got a dot. Some of the other ones of these, the earlier versions that I've got, have got a little crosshair. But you can probably see over against here, there's a little dot showing up. That's not too bad. So let's give it a range test. We'll see what happens. I'm picking a target, which is my Land Rover, about 20 meters away. We're going to arm this thing and see how we go. Well, we just bounced off the roof racks, so it's going to go clearly a long way. Now, I'm fairly friendly with my neighbour, so let's see if we can get it over the fence. Yep, halfway across his fence, so fairly decent. Let's try it off the side of the rover here. Yeah, it's going to work rather well. So it's happily doing 20 meters plus. I'd estimate nearly 30 from there. So yeah, we're doing pretty well. And it's hitting with some force. Straight up, I guess we'll try that. The straight up test, I'm going to go in front of the camera. So it goes up a long way, not quite as far as I'd expect for some of the mods that I've done. It certainly packs enough kick to be loose inside a house with. So yeah, that's the mod for this guy, for the Firestrike Elite. We can probably come up with a better mod for these in the future, but you know what? Before I finish this video, I'm going to get one that I did mod with a longer spring. I now have two other older Nerf Firestrike Elites. These ones, I took springs that weren't designed for these and managed to force them in here. And they are considerably heftier. So let's try on the vehicle. So it's a much faster, steadier shot. Let's try the shot in the air. So they go slightly higher, but to be honest, with the power involved in these guys, it's not a lot different. And we can upset the neighbour again. It actually hit the tree over his property. So I wonder if I can get it in his boat. He'll tell me off about it later. Yep, I scored his boat. Alright, we're done. We'll call this quits. We're having fun with Nerf darts.